Good morning, everyone. My name is Cherime J. Bronyola. I will be giving you a short clip or an idea about the Day of Valor in the Philippines or Araw ng Kagitingan. We celebrate it on April 9 by the virtue of Executive Order number 203, Section 1987. April 9 of every year is Araw ng Kagitingan. Proclamation number 466, Section 1989, on the other hand, designated April 5 to 11 of every year as Philippine Veterans Week in order to promote, preserve, and memorialize the principles, ideas, and deeds of the Filipino war veteran as a means to enhance patriotism and love of the country, especially among the youth of the land. So, the week-long observation is an occasion to honor not only the Filipino war veterans who died and served the country, but also to remember those who render honorable military service in defending the country in times of war or peace. This is gratefully acknowledge their contribute in preserving our sovereignty and defending our national security. By seed, I will be giving you a short uh, background to the historical situation that happened on the April 9, 1942. The Bataan Death March, April 1942, World War II. During the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Second World War, the Imperial Japanese Army committed on the series of war crime in territories they occupied in China, Burma, and Southeast Asia. This crime resulted in 1 million of death of civilians and a prisoner of war. The Bataan Death March was one such atrocity after the surrender of joint U.S. Filipino forces at Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines on April 9, 1942. The Japanese forced 76,000 prisoners to march to the camp of O'Donnell Prison Camp. Account of the total distance of the march vary, but what as approximately 66 miles or 106 kilometers on foot. During the march that lasted to 5 to 10 days depending of one of the prisoner joined. Of war suffered inhuman conditions, severe maltreatment from the Japanese soldier. Many of them never reached the final destination. Immediately after the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese commenced the campaign to seizing the Philippines island, the most important geostrategic position for the control of the Southeast Asia. Main Japanese troops had already landed on the island of Luzon on December 10, but the main attack began in December 22, 1941. The Philippine archipelago was depended no more 150 troops from the U.S. and the Filipino Army by the command of the American General MacArthur. However, he didn't have a command on the Navy. As General MacArthur prepared for the defense of the island, the abandon of the previously made defense scenario was plain or WPO3, which concentrated troops on Manila Bay and deployed troops along the entire archipelago coast. It was costly mistake that allowed the Japanese 14th Army to capture most of the country by the end of December. Facing defeat, General MacArthur switched the plan WPO3, but it was too late. Defense withdrew to the area of Bataan Peninsula that extended into Manila Bay, and the Battle of Bataan began the first week of January 1942. Unlike the rest of the island, the Bataan defenders showed first resistance, but it wasn't enough. The defense was prepared hastily, and they were extremely low on supplies. The nation. Their defeat was imminent on March 11, 1942, General Douglas MacArthur left Manila at the direct order of the U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt. He promised his troops, "I shall return," and repeat the promise afterward in many speeches. The soldier at Bataan, called the Battling Baptists at Bataan, held out for 1 month. Their name was immortalized in the limerick written by the American war correspondent Frank Hulwet, were the battle backer of Bataan. No mama, no papa, no uncle, no cousin, no nieces, no planes, no artillery pieces, and nobody given a damn. And after the 3 months of first combat in the most difficult condition, the Battle of Bataan was over. Soldiers from the Both the Philippines Army and the U.S. Army surrendered to the Japanese forces. However, grueling their effort were in at defending Bataan, it would be nothing compared to the agony that they were about to suffer as Japanese prisoner of war. The Japanese army had expected to conquer the Philippines in just few days, but the amount of the soldier that they captured far exceeded their expectation. They had expected to capture around 30,000 prisoners, but the reality was that 76,000 American Filipino soldiers had laid down their arms. It became tremendous logistic problems from the Japanese, who were able to provide neither transport nor food for such a large number of prisoners. Besides, this Japanese army in general suffered from the shortage of motor transport during the surrender discussion. U.S. Major General Edward King asked for permission to drive the Davao to the Camp O'Donnell in American Army truck, but the Japanese General Masaharu Homa dismissed the request. Eventually, it was decided that the prisoner would march on the foot to the O'Donnell camp. The prisoners were gathered on the municipality of Mariveles, where the march started. On the route went along the coast of Manila Bay to the town of Lubao, and then the San Fernando train station. From the plan was to transport the prisoner by railway to Capas and them on the foot an additional 8 to 10 miles or about 14 kilometers to Camp O'Donnell. At the moment of their surrender, the U.S. and the Filipino soldiers were already exhausted by the arduous combat with the Japanese troops. They were also suffering from malnutrition because of the reduce of food during the final stages of the Battle of Bataan. For the men already in such a bad state, the 66 miles march was sheer torture. The Japanese forced them to march 25 miles per day, which was the average marching speed of the Japanese soldier. Even in the best of condition, the American soldier normally march only 15 to 20 miles per day, contrary to the was planned, and the caravan moved slowly. At the time, they had to make way for the Japanese troop moving southward. To march lasted 4 days, while the first contingent of the prisoners finished their march in 5 days. The last of them arrived in the camp after 10 days. During the entire length of the march, prisoners were exposed to the direct sunlight and tropical temperature over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, making them feel even more exhausted, and the fact that they were denied food and water only made the further journey of agonizingly faced with the substance number of the foe. The Japanese did not have enough food or supply for more of them. Such as the Japanese soldiers were a priority for receiving food ration. The prison only received one meal during the entire march. If they were lucky to receive food at almost, prisoners had their first meal only when they arrived at the prisoner camp. What was the worst was the hunger and the lack of drinking water. The Japanese guard intentionally deprived the prisoner and a lot of soldiers went mad from the thirst and ended up being shot by the Japanese guard or so desperate that they drink the water from the wallow pits and ditches that were filled with animal waste and polluted water caused by dysentery, which most causes had fatal consequences. After the 2 days of lack of food and water had taken it all, the men, as many soldiers were exhausted, they couldn't continue to march. All those who were not able to continue the march faced execution by the group of Japanese soldiers, and they had trailed the process. The American called this group Buzzard Squad. Many of the survived the thirst, the hunger, and did thanks to the bravery of local Filipino. They secretly throw sugar cane and canteen of water along the way so that the prisoner could pick them and get some measure of sustenance. The Japanese guard made the march agony in the prisoner. During the entire journey of the first prison to march and steady face disgraded the fact that the most of them they physically unable to do so. All of those lagging behind were encouraged to continue with bayonets. However, the Japanese guard wasted no time with the POWs who showed a lack of strength to continue. They simply killed them and they left them on the road. The entire route was filled with the bodies of dead with prisoners, and the horrifying image was worsened by the fact that the many of the prisoners were mangled by vehicle as the Japanese ran over them, and the American Filipino prisoners were completely stripped of their dignity. They focus constant abuse of beating for no reason. For Japanese guard will slap, kick, and hit prisoner with the butt, stock of the rifle. Often prisoner were beaten for disobeying order from the Japanese guard, and The prisoner didn't understand what they were being asked to do. This they tried to escape, were shot on or beheaded. Prisoner were to do exhausted to wake up, were they're buried alive in graves, and different reason for the maltreatment lay on the Japanese belief that the Americans and Filipino were less worthy nation. On the top of that, Japanese were furious at the enemy of the resident. They show in the Battle of Bataan, the Japanese guard were possessed by this intense hatred in treating their enemies with merciless cruelty. The prisoners were forced to march until the most of the collapsed bathroom break were the infrequent of the soldier either to hold it or urinate or defecate into the trouser. This caused infection to the wounds of their legs, and the brutal marching break only made for the Japanese guard to rest in the few cases. The prisoners were not allowed to sit down. Anyone who disobeyed would be shot immediately. To make things worse for the prisoner, the Japanese made stuff by artisan will without allowing them to quench their thirst. Once they arrival to San Fernando, they transported the prisoner the railway to the town of Capac, not far from the camp of O'Donnell. It seems like a moment of relief, but it was another stage to the suffering. To the prisoner were packed into the old metal box car that had no opening or any kind of retaliation. In the camp, they received a single bowl of rice as they meal for the most prisoner. It was the first meal since they began to march. Only on the real relief was they were finally able to lay down and rest on their feet, though many of the comrades did not live to see this happen in the days to come. Many continued to die because of the inhuman condition of the camp. Some of these from the exhaustion and dysentery they had caught along the way. Estimated that approximately 650 American soldiers and between 5,000 to 18,000 Filipino soldiers died during the march. After the war, captured General Masahiro Homa, commander of the Japanese 14th Army, was put on the trial war crimes and sentenced to death in 1946. Masahiro Nobisuji, a Japanese officer who ordered the killing the prisoner, avoided Japanese and even served as a member of the force of the Japanese parliament. The Bataan Death March was one of the most war crime in the entire war in the Pacific. It is the horror and truly a perfect example of why historians have named the Second World War the war without mercy. As we celebrate the 80 years of the history of the Day of Valor, while the holiday marked an event which was the victory of the opposing forces to the heroic defense of Bataan by those soldiers was seen as the key event in the war as it allowed the Allies time to prepare for the latter battle which has had the Japanese progress in the Pacific and eventually led in a turn of fortune and Allied victory. The Bataan Peninsula was eventually retaken by the American and Filipino forces on the February 8, 1945. To mark the day, veterans from the Second World War will parade in many cities across the Philippines. Without the historical history that happened in the 1945 of our lolos and lolas during the World War II, we will never witness how uh, how we wins on the fight on the Japanese with the help of the US soldiers. So, dili siya lalim ang pinagdaanan, ang mga gibuhat sa atong mga lolos o lolas katong panahon sa World War II. So, uhaw, gutom, kapoy, ang ilang mga na-encounter atong panahon na. So, karon kung ato to siyang i-apply sa millennial generation, so, kinahanglan dili lang dapat nato yanu-yanuhon atong mga lolog lola, no? So they are the one who fight for our country. So kung buot pasabot ana na irespeto nato atong mga tigulang for helping them, feeding them, kung unsa man tong ilang mga kinahanglanon sa kinabuhi, no? So ato sa gobyerno ila sad sila gi ah, prioritize, so gipangtagaan na sila og mga naa sila sa veteran hospital, gisuportaan sila didto without dili na sila kinahanglan mo bayad sa ilang bills didto, so ang gobyerno na ang gabayad sa ilaha. So mao na siya na thankful kaayo ta sa ato ang mga lolog lola katong mga panahon sa gera, no? So mao to siya, and may naatay nakatunan sa panginabuhi nato diri sa mabuhay ang Pilipinas. Thank you, and God bless to everyone.